What would you do if you rode into a town that had already decided you would fail, and the only thing they were willing to sell you was a ranch the wind had chewed to pieces? What would you do if the price on the paper was $2, and the laughter behind you was louder than the coins in your palm? At 23, Arthur Ward did exactly that. He signed his name on a storm-broken deed for the cost of a bowl of stew, and the whole of Cinder Valley wagered he would be gone by first thaw. But what happened between that signing and the last golden light of fall is a story worth settling in for. Pour something warm. Let us know where you're watching from. Stay close. The road into Cinder Valley in the late spring of that year was pale as bone and twice as dry. Arthur Ward rode in on a gray gelding whose ribs were beginning to show. His plain work shirt darkened at the collar with the salt of 4 days' travel. His worn waistcoat buttoned wrong at the bottom and never corrected. His scuffed leather boots hung loose in the stirrups. He carried no rifle across his knee, only a canvas roll tied behind the cantle and a small tin box wrapped in oilcloth against his hip. Inside the tin were 3 things: a folded letter from a lawyer in a town 200 miles east, a bent horseshoe nail his father had once given him for luck, and a scrap of trail map drawn in a hand he had not seen in 11 years. His father was 3 months in the ground. The little freighting outfit they had built together on the eastern flats had been sold to pay the doctor and the debts the doctor left behind. What remained had fit into the canvas roll. What did not fit had been buried with the man who taught him how to read weather off a horse's ear. The valley opened before him at the end of a long grade, a wide bowl of pale grass and slate ridges with a thin creek stitching through it like a silver thread pulled loose from a coat. The town sat at the near end, a scatter of plank buildings the color of driftwood, a livery, a chapel with a tilted cross, and a saloon whose sign had faded until only the word house remained. Smoke rose from 3 chimneys. A dog barked once and then thought better of it. Arthur touched the gray's neck and rode in slowly, because slow was all the horse had left, and slow was all he had left too. Men on the porch of the saloon watched him pass without speaking. A boy in a flat cap stopped sweeping the boardwalk to stare. A woman in a gray apron carried a basket across the road and did not look up. He tied the gray at the trough outside the livery, loosened the girth, and stood a long moment with his hand on the animal's shoulder. Grief was a weight he had learned to carry the way other men carried a coat. He did not set it down. He only shifted it, breathed once, and walked toward the low clapboard building at the end of the street, where a hand-painted board read Land Office, Inquiries Inside. He did not yet know that by nightfall he would own a ruin, and that half the valley would be laughing about it before the lantern was lit. The land clerk was a narrow man with ink-stained cuffs and spectacles that had slipped down to the very end of his nose. When Arthur laid the lawyer's letter on the counter and asked, in a voice hardly louder than a breath, whether there was any parcel to be had by an honest man with little coin, the clerk looked up as though a joke had walked in wearing boots. He rummaged in a drawer, pulled out a curled sheet of foolscap furred at the edges, and set it down with the care one gives a thing already dead. Bracken Hollow Ranch, the clerk said. Storm took the roof 2 winters back. Owner walked off. Creek claims tangled. Taxes owed against it come to about what a plate of eggs runs. $2 clears it. Nobody will touch it. Arthur read the deed once, and then again. He read the description of the boundaries, the mention of a house, a barn, a smokehouse, 240 acres, and a share in the run of Antler Creek that the clerk had already dismissed as tangled. He read the small line at the bottom noting the last surveyor's mark and the initials of the man who had drawn it. His father's initials. J.W. He did not blink. He did not lift his head. He only laid 2 silver coins on the counter, and the clerk stared at him as though he had asked to buy the moon. "Son," the clerk said, "you understand what you are buying." "I understand," Arthur murmured. The clerk shrugged, dipped his pen, wrote the name Arthur Ward in the ledger beside the words Bracken Hollow, and turned the deed for signing. The scratch of the nib was the only sound in the room. When it was done, the clerk slid the paper across and said, without cruelty and without warmth, "Good luck to you." By the time Arthur stepped back into the street, the news had already outrun him. A man on the saloon porch called out something that ended in laughter. Another slapped his thigh. A voice from the livery said clearly, $2 for 240 acres of nothing. Someone else said, "He'll be gone by spring." A third said, "Not even. First storm sends him running." The gray gelding lifted its head at the trough and looked at Arthur with the patient exhaustion of an animal that had seen many towns and expected little from any of them. Arthur folded the deed once, slid it into the tin box beside the bent nail and the scrap of map, and closed the lid with a soft click that only he could hear. Would you have signed that paper, knowing the whole town was already laughing? Would you have carried 2 silver coins across a counter for a ranch the wind had eaten? What did the clerk not know about those initials at the bottom of the deed? If this story has already caught you, drop a word below telling us where you're watching from, tap that like, and stay subscribed. Because what Arthur Ward found waiting at the end of the ridge road is only just beginning to stir. The laughter did not stop when Arthur crossed the street. It followed him the way flies follow a slow horse, patient and unhurried, certain there would be more to feed on before the day was out. He walked without haste toward the livery, keeping his eyes on the middle distance the way his father had taught him, and let the sound break around his shoulders without taking hold. A boy of maybe 10 leaned on the porch rail of the saloon and mimicked a man falling off a chair, then pointed at Arthur and giggled behind his hand, until an older man cuffed him gently on the ear and told him to hush, though the older man was smiling too. Inside the shade of the saloon doorway, a broad-shouldered man in a black frock coat stepped out into the light. His waistcoat was fine wool with a watch chain of real weight, and his boots had never seen a full day of grass. He crossed his arms and studied Arthur with the pleasure of a man who has found a new form of entertainment. "You the boy who bought Bracken Hollow," he said. It was not a question. Arthur stopped at the trough and rested one hand on the gelding's shoulder. "I am," he said. The man in the frock coat laughed once, a short bark that carried down the plank walk. "Name's Halloran, Rutger Halloran. I run the north end of this valley and most of the middle." He let that sit a moment. "I'll give you $3 for that deed. Right now. Tear it up before you shame yourself." A few men on the porch chuckled at the pretended kindness of the offer. Arthur took a slow breath. He looked at the mountains beyond the roofs, then back at Halloran. "The deed's not for sale," he said. Halloran's smile thinned. "For then? Buy yourself a decent meal and a ticket east." "Not for sale," Arthur repeated, and his voice was no louder than before. Halloran shook his head, with the air of a man watching a fool walk into a river. "2 winters, no roof. Creek's gone crooked in the papers. Whoever held it before ran off in the night and never sent word. There's a reason nobody wanted it, son. There's always a reason." He tapped his temple. "Remember I offered. Remember when the wind is coming through your ribs in January." He turned on his heel and went back into the house, and the porchmen followed him inside as though pulled by a string. Arthur tightened the girth and led the gelding across the road toward the general store to lay in what little he could carry. Barrels of flour and salt pork lined the wall, and the smell of coffee and kerosene hung in the plank rafters. He counted his coins twice and bought careful things: a pound of beans, a twist of coffee, a small tin of matches, a sack of oats for the horse, a coil of new rope, and a candle. The storekeeper, a woman with iron-gray hair pulled tight, watched him without pity and without scorn while she wrapped the goods in brown paper. When she handed him his change, she said only, "You'll want more rope than that," and turned away. He was tying the bundle behind the cantle when he became aware of someone standing very still at his elbow. The man was old in a way that made age itself seem like a trade he had mastered. His face was burnt brown and lined like a creek bed in drought, and his eyes were pale and clear as spring water. He wore a battered hat with a leather thong under the chin and carried nothing but a walking stick worn smooth at the grip. Arthur touched his hat brim. The old man did not touch his in return. He only looked at Arthur for a long moment, then passed him toward the ridge road, then back. "The hollow remembers who buried it," the old man said. His voice was soft and level, the way a man speaks when he has said the words before to himself many times and is only now letting them out. "Go careful with the water. It knows its own name." Arthur waited for more, but nothing came. He opened his mouth to ask what the man meant, and the old man was already turning, already walking away with the unhurried stride of someone who had delivered exactly what he came to deliver. In 3 steps he was around the corner of the store. In 5 he was gone. Arthur stood a moment with one hand on the rope. He did not fully hear the words yet, not in the way he would hear them later, but they settled into him and found a shelf and stayed there. He mounted the gray gelding, turned its head north, and rode out of town along the rutted track that climbed toward the slate ridges. Behind him, a fresh peal of laughter rose from the saloon porch, then thinned, then vanished into the wide, indifferent afternoon. The ridge road climbed easy at first, then steeper, cutting between 2 shoulders of pale rock where the wind moved dry grass in long silver waves. Arthur let the gelding walk. He did not press it. 4 days of travel were still stored in the animal's legs, and the last miles were the ones that mattered. The sun leaned west, and the light took on the soft copper tone that the high country gives up an hour before dusk. Meadowlarks rose from the grass at his passing, sang a few notes, and dropped again. A hawk turned slow circles above the far side of the ridge, watching something Arthur could not see. He crested the last rise near sundown, and Bracken Hollow lay spread below him in the changing light. For a long moment he did not move. The valley within the valley was a shallow bowl of pale grass tilting down to a thread of water that caught the low sun and held it like a strip of poured brass. On the near slope stood the house, or what had been the house. Half the roof was gone, the rest sagged inward as though the beams were tired of pretending. The barn beyond it leaned east on failing timbers, its big door hanging by one hinge, black inside as a mouth. A smokehouse squatted between them, roof intact but door missing, and past the smokehouse, a broken fence line ran off into willow scrub along the creek. No smoke rose from any chimney. No dog barked. The wind came up over the far ridge and moved through the willows, and the sound it made was not welcome and not hostile, only old. Arthur dismounted and stood a while, holding the reins loosely. His first thought, honest and unhidden, was that Halloran had been right. His second thought, quieter, was that his father had drawn a map that led here. and his father had never drawn a map to nothing. He led the gelding down the slope at a walk. Up close, the ruin was worse. The porch boards were rotted through in 3 places. A window frame had come loose and hung by a single nail, tapping softly against the sill each time the wind touched it. Weeds grew up through the front step. Somewhere inside, water had done its slow work on the floorboards, and the smell that came through the open door was of cold ash and damp wood and the particular emptiness of a place no living breath had warmed in a long time. Arthur did not go inside, not yet. He unsaddled the gelding on the flat behind the house, out of the wind, and hobbled it loosely in a patch of good grass near the creek. He brushed it down with slow, steady strokes, checked its feet, and let it drink. The water in the creek was clean and cold, and moved with more strength than he had expected from something that looked so thin from the ridge. He cupped a handful and tasted it. Sweet. He crouched there a long minute, watching the light go out of the surface. He made no fire in the house. He built a small one of pine twigs and dry sage on a bare patch of dirt, 20 paces from the porch, boiled a little coffee in a tin cup, and ate a strip of jerky and a hard biscuit slowly, chewing each bite the full count. The stars came out one by one over the slate ridge, and then all at once, and the sky above Bracken Hollow was so wide it felt like a decision the land had made long ago, and had not gone back on since. He rolled his canvas beside the fire and lay on his back with the tin box under his hand. He did not sleep at first. He listened. The willows shifted. The creek turned over on itself down among the stones. Something small, a mouse maybe, moved in the dry grass near the barn. The wind rose once and pushed against the ruined roof of the house, and the timbers answered with a low groan that was almost a word. Arthur listened harder. It came again and again, and the third time it seemed to him that the house was not complaining. It was breathing, slow and stubborn and not yet done. He closed his eyes with one hand still on the tin box and did not know, when sleep finally took him, whether the sound that followed him down was the creak or the beams or the old man's voice saying the hollow remembers who buried it. He woke before the light. The fire was down to a red eye in gray ash, and the gelding stood quiet in the grass with its head lowered, one ear turned toward the barn. Frost lay on the canvas in a thin skin. Arthur sat up slow, stiff in the shoulders, and rebuilt the fire with the last of the pine twigs and a handful of sage that snapped when he broke it. He warmed his hands and watched the hollow come out of the dark. Blue light first, then a pale gold along the ridge, then the ruined roof of the house catching the color as if it were remembering how to hold light. He drank his coffee standing. He walked the ground first, before he touched anything with a tool. That was a thing his father had taught him on the freight roads. Walk the ground before you unpack. Know what the place is doing before you decide what you are doing. He walked to the barn. The door hung by its one hinge and rested at an angle in the packed dirt. Inside, the dark smelled of old hay and colder, older mineral things. A shaft of morning light came through a gap in the roof and landed across the far wall, and there Arthur saw the first thing that did not fit. The wall was framed in weathered pine, gone gray with time, but one beam near the ceiling was darker. Newer, not by much. The saw marks on it were straighter than the rest, and it had been notched to fit into the older frame with a care no storm and no abandonment could explain. Arthur stood a long time looking up at it. A beam does not put itself in a wall. Someone had climbed a ladder in a barn nobody wanted and set a new beam into a roof nobody meant to keep. He said nothing. He set it aside in his mind, the way a man sets a stone in his pocket, to think about later. He walked to the smokehouse. The door was gone, as he had seen the day before, but the frame stood square and true, and the hooks inside the low ceiling had been oiled not long enough ago for the oil to have blackened. He rubbed a finger along one hook, and it came away with a faint amber sheen. He wiped his finger on his trousers and stepped back into the morning. He walked the fence line down toward the willows. Where the broken rails ended, a single post stood alone in the scrub, leaning but not fallen. Arthur pushed it with the heel of his hand, and it did not move. He knelt. The post had been sunk deep and packed with stone at the base, and on the side that faced the creek, low, near the dirt where a man would only see it if he were kneeling, someone had carved 2 letters into the wood. J.W. The cuts were old, and the wood had grown around them, but the shape was clean. His father's initials. His father, who had never in Arthur's knowing set foot in this valley. Or so Arthur had believed until 3 days ago in a lawyer's office 200 miles east. He stayed on one knee a long time. He touched the letters with the pad of his thumb. The wind came down the hollow and moved the willows, and the creek turned over its stones, and somewhere behind him the gelding stamped once, softly, as if to say it was still there. He did not dig. He did not pry at the post. He stood up and dusted his knee and walked back toward the fire. The sun was fully over the ridge now, and the frost had gone off the canvas. He drank the last of the coffee cold. He thought about the beam in the barn and the oil on the hooks and the 2 letters cut into a post. No one but a kneeling man would find, and he did not yet allow himself a conclusion. He only allowed himself a next task. The next task was work. He began with the porch, because a man cannot live in a house he cannot walk up to. He cut the rotted boards out with the hatchet from his roll, and pried the nails loose one by one and straightened them on a flat stone with the back of the head, because new nails cost coin, and he had none to spend on what old nails could still do. He laid the good boards he salvaged in a stack under the eaves, and marked in his mind the 3 lengths he would need to cut from the barn's fallen timbers to replace what was gone. The gelding grazed in the grass by the creek and lifted its head each time the hatchet fell, then lowered it again when the sound settled. By mid-morning, his hands had the ache of a body remembering itself. He stopped at the trough behind the house and pumped the handle. It resisted, and then gave, and then a rusty water came up, and then, after a long minute, water clear enough to drink. Arthur stood watching it run into his cupped palm. Someone had kept this pump. Someone had greased the leather in it inside the last 2 winters, or it would not have caught at all. He wiped his hand on his shirt and went back to work. He cleared the front room of the house next. He carried out the ruined tick mattress and the wet ash from the stove and the broken pieces of a chair that had once been good. He swept the floor with a bundle of sage tied to a stick, because a broom was another thing he did not have. Under the ash of the stove, when he had shoveled it clean, he found a boot print pressed into the old soot at the back of the firebox. A small print. Not a child's, but not a big man's either. The tread was worn on the outside edge, the way a man walks who favors one hip. Arthur crouched and looked at it, and felt something go quiet in his chest. He closed the stove door. At noon he ate a biscuit and drank from the pump, and sat on the top step of the porch he had just made walkable. The gelding came up from the creek on its own, and stood at the foot of the step, and put its nose against Arthur's knee. Arthur laid a hand along its jaw and did not speak. The horse breathed out, slow, and the breath was warm on his palm. That afternoon he worked on the barn door, He lifted it off its one hinge, laid it flat, and rebuilt the top hinge from a strap of leather and an iron bolt he pulled from the smokehouse frame. When he raised the door back into place, it stood almost square. He pushed it closed, and it held. He stood in the sudden dim of the barn and looked up again at the beam that did not match. From below now, in the afternoon light coming through the door, he could see there was a mark on the underside of it, not a carving, a brand. A shallow burn in the shape of a small crooked line, like a creek bending twice. His hands, which had spent the morning learning the shape of this place board by board and nail by nail, understood before his mind did. They stilled at his sides. He looked from the beam to the door to the fence post down in the willows, and the 3 points made a line, and the line pointed toward the creek. He did not follow it. Not yet. He climbed down from the barn, latched the door, and went to see to the horse before the light went. 3 days he waited before he followed the line. Not from fear. From the old freight road habit his father had drilled into him. Do not open a thing before you have made yourself steady enough to see what is inside it. He mended the smokehouse door with cut boards from the barn's fallen timbers. He set 2 new posts in the fence and stretched wire he found, rolled in a corner of the barn under sacking, dry and unrusted, as if someone had put it away for a season that had never come. He ate sparingly. He slept beside the porch and watched the ridge at dawn. On the 4th morning, he took the hatchet and a spade he had straightened over the fire, and he walked the line, the beam, the barn door, the leaning post, with his father's initials. He stood at the post and turned to face the creek and walked slowly through the willows. 20 paces in, the ground dipped where it should not have dipped, and the grass grew thicker in a rough oval the size of a wagon bed. Arthur knelt. He pushed the spade in. It struck wood on the second push. He cleared the dirt with his hands. A plank came up, then another, weathered on top and pale on the underside, cut clean. Beneath the planks was a shallow chamber lined with flat river stones. In the chamber sat a cedar box no larger than a saddlebag, wrapped twice in oilcloth and tied with waxed cord. He did not open it there. He carried it back to the porch step and set it in the sun. The cord had not rotted. The oilcloth peeled back stiff. Inside the cedar box was a leather-bound ledger, a folded square of tracing paper, a small brass key on a loop of rawhide, and a letter sealed with a smear of tallow. Arthur opened the letter first. He knew the hand before he had read a word. The letter was short. His father wrote that in the years before Arthur was born he had ridden with a survey party through Cinder Valley and had filed a water claim on Antler Creek in his own name. That he had built the first cabin at Bracken Hollow with 2 other men, and that when a woman he had loved died in her 2nd winter here, he had left the valley and never come back. He wrote that he had kept the claim alive by paying the small assessments through a lawyer 200 miles east, $1 a year, quiet as a lamp. He wrote that the deed to the surface land had passed through other hands and been let go, but the water right had not. He wrote that the water right held. He wrote that whoever owned the paper on Bracken Hollow held the run of Antler Creek from the ridge notch down to the flats, and that every ranch below drank from that run. He wrote in the last line, "Son, if you are reading this, the ground has kept its word." Arthur sat on the porch a long while with the letter open on his knee. The gelding stood in the yard and watched him. He unfolded the tracing paper next. It was a plat drawn in his father's careful surveyor's hand. The creek from the notch down, the diversion points marked in tiny numerals, and along the margin the initials and dates of every assessment paid, 23 of them in a neat column, the last one from the winter before his father died. The ledger held the rest. Names of ranchers who had drawn from Antler Creek without paper. Halloran's name appeared 11 times. Dates, head counts. A quiet, patient accounting, kept by a man who had not been in the valley, but had never taken his hand off it. Arthur closed the ledger. He did not weep. He put his palm flat on the cover and left it there while the sun moved off the porch. That night, he slept inside the house for the first time, on the swept floor, with the cedar box beside him and the brass key on its rawhide loop around his neck. The storm came 4 days later. It came off the slate ridges without warning, a black shoulder of cloud that ate the afternoon light in an hour. Arthur was up on the barn roof laying salvage shingle when the wind first hit. He came down the ladder 2 rungs at a time. He got the gelding into the barn, pushed the mended door shut against a gust that shook the frame, and ran for the house through rain that was already sideways. The house held. The new porch boards held. The old timbers groaned as they had groaned his first night, slow and stubborn, and did not give. Arthur crouched by the stove and fed it small pine and watched the window frame he had nailed square rattle and stay. Then, through the noise, a sound that was not the storm. A horse. A voice. He opened the door into the wind. Down at the willows, a wagon had come off the ridge trail and pitched sideways into the creek scrub, one wheel broken, the horse in its traces plunging and tangled. A man was in the water to his knees, trying to hold a child up out of the current. A woman was on the far bank with another child pressed to her coat. Arthur went. He did not think about the letter or the ledger or the brass key against his chest. He went into the creek with the coil of new rope he had bought in town for the last of his coin, and he cut the horse free of the traces first, because a panicked horse in water will drown a man before it saves him. He got the animal up onto the bank. He waded back and took the child from the man's arms and carried her to the woman and set her down and turned and went back for the man, who had gone to one knee in the cold. He got them to the house. All 4 of them. He built the stove up until the iron ticked. He gave them his blankets and his coffee and the last of his beans. The woman was shaking so hard she could not hold the cup, and Arthur held it to her mouth while her husband pulled the smaller child inside his coat and rocked and said nothing. When the man could speak, he said his name was Elmer Doss, that he was a freighter running late supplies to the North Ranches, that the ridge trail had washed under his wheel. He said, plain, "You saved my family." Arthur shook his head once and put more wood on the fire. The storm blew all night. Arthur sat by the door with the hatchet across his knees and watched the roof of the house he had bought for $2 refuse to come down. Somewhere before dawn, with the family asleep in a heap by the stove and the gelding quiet in the barn, he understood that he had already chosen. He had chosen the first night, when he had set the fire 20 paces from the porch instead of riding back to town. Everything since had only been the choosing again. Outside, the creek ran hard and high and kept its own name in the dark. By mid-morning, the storm had blown itself thin over the flats, and the valley lay bright and battered under a scrubbed sky. Elmer Doss walked out onto the porch with the smaller child asleep against his shoulder, and stood a long moment looking at the mended boards under his boots. He asked how a man alone had put a place like this back on its feet in less than a season. Arthur said he had not done it alone, and nodded at the gelding in the yard. Doss laughed once, quiet, and did not press. Doss and his family rode out at noon on a borrowed axle Arthur fashioned from a sound length of barn beam. Before he left, Doss took Arthur's hand in both of his and said he would be through Cinder Valley again inside a week, and that when he came, he would not come alone. He was as good as his word. 3 days later, a wagon came up the ridge road with Doss driving and a thin man in a black coat riding beside him. The thin man introduced himself as the county water clerk out of the seat 60 miles south and said he had come at the request of a freighter whose family owed a debt. He asked politely to see the papers. Arthur laid the cedar box open on the porch step. The clerk read the letter first, then the tracing paper, then the ledger. He turned each page slowly. When he was finished, he set his hands flat on his knees and looked out at Antler Creek running full down toward the flats. "Mr. Ward," he said, "your father's filing is clean. 23 assessments, paid on the year, unbroken. The right runs with the paper, and the paper is yours." Arthur said only, "I thought so." The clerk stayed the night in the house and left in the morning with a copy of the plat folded inside his coat. Word traveled ahead of him. It was in Cinder Valley by the time his wagon reached the flats, and it moved through the plank buildings the way water moves through dry grass, quick and low and everywhere at once. By the end of that week, riders had begun coming up the ridge road. A small rancher from the South Bend with his hat in his hand, then 2 brothers from the Middle Grass, then an older man who ran cattle along the notch. They came to ask about the creek. Arthur met each of them on the porch, showed them the plat, and named a fair share by the head. No man he spoke to left angry. Several left with their hats still in their hands. Halloran came on the 9th day. He rode up alone on a good bay horse in his black frock coat, and he did not dismount until Arthur came out. He looked at the porch, the mended barn door, the fence line running clean into the willows. He looked at the gelding standing quiet in the yard. Then he swung down and stood in the dust with his hat held against his chest. "I made you an offer once," Halloran said. "It was low." "It was," Arthur said. Halloran was silent a long moment. "My cattle drink from that creek." "I know. What do you ask?" Arthur named the same share he had named for the small ranchers. Halloran blinked once, slowly, as if a thing he had expected to be sharp had come to him soft. He said, "That is fair. It is meant to be." Halloran put his hat back on and put out his hand. Arthur took it. There was no crowd to see it, only the gelding and the wind moving in the willows. But the handshake was the thing the whole valley had been waiting on without knowing it. When Halloran rode down the ridge road, he rode slower than he had come up. The chorus on the saloon porch went quiet after that. In town, when Arthur came in for nails or coffee, the men who had laughed touched their hats and stepped aside. The iron-gray storekeeper wrapped his goods without a word about rope. The boy of about 10, who had mimicked a man falling off a chair, now watched him from the porch with round, careful eyes. Once on the boardwalk, the old man with the walking stick passed him and paused and said, "The hollow remembered." Then he went on and did not turn. By fall, the paper Arthur held ran the water of half the valley, and every ranch below Bracken Hollow drank by his hand. He never raised the share. He never called in the ledger. He wrote each name into a new book of his own keeping, and marked each payment in a neat column beside it. 23 lines long before the first frost, the way his father had done before him. On an evening in late September, Arthur stood on the ridge above the hollow with the gelding beside him and watched the light come down gold across the pale grass, across the mended roof, across the run of Antler Creek, bending twice through the willows like the brand burned into the beam. The air smelled of dry sage and cold stone. Somewhere below, a calf called once and was answered. Elmer Doss had come by that afternoon with a sack of good coffee and a length of milled board as a gift, and had asked Arthur, standing in the yard, what he called the place now that it was more than a ruin. Arthur had thought a long moment before he answered. "I did not build a ranch," he had said. "I kept a promise." Doss had nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he has heard the true thing. Now, on the ridge, Arthur put his hand along the gelding's jaw. The tin box was in the house on the mantel above the stove, and the brass key was still on its rawhide loop against his chest, warm from the day. He stood there until the gold went out of the grass and the blue hour came up out of the creek. And then he walked the gray down the slope toward the lantern he had left burning in the window. Thank you for staying to the end of this one, for riding the long road up out of dust into daylight with a quiet man who would not be moved. If the story warmed you, leave a word below. Share it with someone who needs the reminder that patience is its own kind of strength, and stay close for the next tale waiting down the trail.